Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our first session in the beginner stream of today's Postal History Symposium. The the theme for this first session, it's going to be a panel discussion on getting started in postal history. I'm very pleased to have uh, you know, the pleasure of introducing Elizabeth Sodero, who is going to be moderating this panel. And I'll just read a brief bio for her. Um, Elizabeth Sodero, as a 5-year-old living in Sydney, Nova Scotia, discovered the joys of stamps. She loved stamps, the thought of stamps, and the world they pictured. In the 1950s, she, like me, joined the CBC Stamp Club with Doug and Mary Patrick, and listened on Saturday mornings to those broadcasts. Starting in 1980, she took on a number of roles with the Nova Scotia Stamp Club, including director, secretary, newsletter editor, and for a short time as treasurer. 1999, she became the director of the RPSC, looked after the slide program, and in the year 2003 became an RPSC fellow. When she attended the major Glasgow 2000 stamp show, Elizabeth discovered that what really interested her was social philately, and her collections and exhibits since then have reflected that interest. Her collections and stories include Eller House, W.P. Colchester, George and Gussie, by the way, which is available on the RPSC website, and it's quite a beautiful story. Small covers, family ties, mourning, and so on. She also collects Admiral 5, 10, and 8-cent usages. And finally, when she's traveling in places like Paris and London, looks forward to exploring the stamp markets in places like Charing Cross and other places, looking for sort of discovered treasures. Joining her in the panel is Jane Sodero, Elizabeth's daughter. Jane started collecting stamps in second grade and quickly developed an interest in postal history as well as postcards. Credited as a national level judge in both Canada and the United States since 2008, Jane exhibits Guysborough County, Nova Scotia postal history and Nova Scotia postcards, as well as the 1955 kayak stamps. She's a member of the RPSC, PHSC, APS, AAPE, and Nova Scotia Stamp Club, and BNAPS, among other specialty groups. She's reviewed exhibits as part of the AAPE Exhibit Critique Service, and is currently president of the RPSC Philatelic Research Foundation. So Elizabeth and all of the panelists, I'm really looking forward to all of the things that you are going to be able to bring to our discussion this morning. And I would invite you, Elizabeth, to unmute yourself and proceed.
Hello. Am I heard? Well, good morning, good afternoon, whatever. Nice to see you all. And this is kind of a historic time, as was pointed out earlier, the first of this sort of an approach to postal history. So the participants in our panel are Howard Spunt and Tops, who does have a surname, but he declared it was unpronounceable, I think, and so we call him Tops, and daughter Jane Soderow. We're going to start with Howard's presentation, and Howard, uh, his name is Howard Spunt. Spunt rhymes with front. Born in Montreal, lives in Ottawa, retired from the Canadian Foreign Service, posted to Scotland, the United States, Zambia, and Germany. So, wow. An active volunteer in his community, and he consults extensively on issues of international migration and human rights. Still travels widely in Canada and abroad and enjoys photography, music, and creative writing. And in his spare time, he says, he enjoys philately. He has been collecting Canada for over 55 years and joined the Postal History Society of Canada about 4 years ago. So we're going to ask Howard to proceed with his presentation, and we're asking that any questions be asked after the presentation. So, Howard and Jane.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Elizabeth. I see that there is a slide that says what postal history means to me, and that's great. It's probably more attractive than looking at my face, but that's okay. So good afternoon, and I'd like to share what Canadian postal history means to me and to tell you about what drove me in that direction and how I organize and enjoy my collection. As Elizabeth mentioned, I started collecting the postage stamps of Canada and the provinces about 56 years ago. Eventually, the images on the stamps became more important than the impulse to collect each and every stamp, varieties and all. So I set myself the goal to find or to physically experience, not yet, please, with the slides.
Right.
Yeah, I'll ask you to switch, Jane.
Okay.
So I set myself the goal to find or physically experience as many as possible of the people, the places, the objects, and events depicted on or suggested by Canada's postage stamps. So you'll recognize some of these names as I go through them. To meet my goal, I sailed aboard the namesake daughter of the iconic Blue Nose, which, as Stan Rogers said, is portrayed on every dime. I crossed the Quebec Bridge and met Bonhomme Carnival. When I traveled to Alberta, I hiked near Mount Edith Cavell, and I spotted a beaver and a whooping crane in Wood Buffalo National Park. I know I'll probably never own a copy of the 12-penny Black Queen Victoria, but I did visit the capital of British Columbia named for her. Similarly, I stood at John McCrae's monument in Belgium's Flanders Fields, and I wear a remembrance poppy. So for me, philately became so much more enjoyable when I self-actualized the stamps. And to date, I've achieved about 90% of them. On my Canadian travels, I was surprised to discover how often the Postal Service intersects with my interests beyond the stamps themselves. So just to share a few memories with you, in Capriole, Ontario, I hopped aboard an old CNR mail car. In Lac du Bonnet, I found a cairn commemorating Manitoba's first airmail flights and their bush pilots. In Arthabaska, Quebec, which is near Victoriaville, I enjoyed the Postal Museum in Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier's 1910 prototype office. I was surprised that another Laurier-type post office was in Morden, Manitoba, and it became the town emblem, adorning all of its street signs. In one of my greatest adventures in 2017, at the abandoned hamlet of Dundas Harbor in the high Arctic, I stood behind the counter of a derelict RCMP station that had also served as the post office for 52 Inuit who were resettled there in 1934. I also began to appreciate the importance of our postal system as a vital communications link between Canada's far-flung communities. I spoke to postal workers on a tour of the mail processing plant in Mississauga, and on a trip to Battle Harbor, Labrador, I schmoozed with the former postmistress. She even extracted an old canceling hammer and let me strike away. That was fun. I suppose that my interest in postal history grew out of my wanderlust. Someone once told me that postal history generally referred to rates, routes, markings, means of transport, and the development of postal services. About 10 years ago, I started gathering cancellations from every place in Canada I had ever been. I also found a postcard I had mailed to myself from aboard the CPR Canadian transcontinental train. I noted that it had been canceled with a railway post office hammer. So I started collecting RPOs as well. And before you knew it, I was collecting pock boats, dog sled covers, first flights, even a Zeppelin. I also learned that many post offices did not operate in federal government buildings, but out of general stores, mines, sanatoriums, and even residential schools. So I began collecting examples of different post offices. Eventually, I decided to display my collection in a way that reflects who I am as a person, my identity, my personality, and my passions. So I do this by connecting myself with the postal history I collect. And then I animate the postal history with maps, charts, and photos that drill down into my journeys and memoirs. I brought a few illustrations to give you a better idea of how my collection is organized and what it means to me. So thanks, Jane, for your technical assistance with the slides. And let's move to the next slide. So I use 3-ring binders and vario pages to create one or more volumes for each province and territory. In addition to the actual postal history covers, cancellations, and so forth, each volume contains an overview, interpretive sections, notes, and references. Some volumes include special displays. For example, my military post office volume displays correspondence from my late father, who served at various locations in Canada and in Europe during World War II. For appearance sake, I usually present the material in 3 different sections: stamps off paper, stamps and postmarks on piece, i.e. cut from covers, and then the covers and postcards. Next slide, please. Thank you. Most of the stamps canceled off paper fit Vario 7S and 8S pages. Those on piece usually fit 5S and 6S. For each item, I create a label that includes the post office name, stamp catalog number, and type of cancellation. The slide that you're looking at shows the early evolution of different cancellations used in Montreal. But in other volumes, I can present provincial cancellations by town in alphabetical order. Next slide. I use 2S varios for most of my covers, such as the 1841 Montreal Lower Canada barrel that you see above. What you're seeing is actually housed within the top or bottom of a 2S vario. Next slide, please. Similarly, I sometimes use 1S pages for emphasis or to exhibit exceptional items, such as this 1868 Montreal Q cover. which has contradictory ratings on it. And of course, in any case, I describe each cover according to its type, its franking and postal markings, which include the rates, cancellations, transit and receiver postmarks, other hand stamps, and special features. When I want to emphasize unusual or attractive elements on both sides of the cover, I use clear 1C or 2C barios. Next slide, please. So this slide is an excerpt from a chart listing my Prince Edward Island post offices. It shows the location or post office name, its opening and closing dates, and then under the notes section, it can include name changes and other historical information. Much of the information that's contained here and in similar charts for other provinces comes from the Library and Archives Canada Post Offices and Postmasters 1851 to 1981 database, which is available online. Next slide, please. Sometimes I scan and display representative postmarks to guide my research. They're not comprehensive. They're there because they strike me as being unusual or because they are clear. They represent clarity that is not necessarily evident in some of the covers themselves. So I use a limited amount of my limited scanning ability to do illustrations like this. Next slide, please. So the research that I do allows me to create charts to help me identify postmarks and their varieties. What you're looking at is an excerpt from my Prince Edward Island research, and I use shapes, location, indicia, dates of usage, and other factors. I rely heavily, I must point out, on the outstanding work of the Postal History Society of Canada and BNAP study groups, whose meticulous databases and classification makes this field of postal history so much more enjoyable and easy for me to navigate. So thanks to all of you who have been part of these groups. A boon, a blessing. Next slide, please. I also make use of photos and maps. This is the top of a single page, which shows Ross House in Winnipeg, the oldest post office in Western Canada. And next slide. Below that is the text that accompanies the picture on the same page. It speaks to the development of postal services, routes, and means of transportation between 1812 and 1871. Next slide. On the following page in that particular volume, behind the post office, there's a map that shows mail routes from 1853 to 1856 that connected the pre-Manitoba Red River settlement with the rest of Canada, mainly through the United States. Next slide. I use maps for different purposes. This is a slide of a map of Lambton County, Ontario, not far from where Bob Stock hangs out when he's eating cheese in Woodstock, that shows how maps can be used to illustrate the opening and closing of post offices over time. There is a subsequent map, which isn't shown here, which is the same view, but has many fewer of those blue dots, which shows that over time, as different factors have come into effect, technology, ability of people to drive further distances, and so forth, the closure of post offices. Sometimes I use railway and steamship maps to show traveling post office routes, and I sometimes even cut and paste postmarks on a regional or city map to show their location. Next slide, please. This is a photo that I took in 2017 of the display panel at the old Arthabaska post office near Victoriaville. I use it to animate a section in my collection about the development of Canadian postal services. Next slide. That's included in error. Jane, please continue to the next one. Okay, I've not checked the provenance on this one, and possibly Mr. O'Reilly, possibly Kevin can help me with this one offline later on. But it purports to be a cover that was carried on the fateful last voyage of the Eastern Arctic Patrol ship, the Nescope, that operated between 1932 and 1947 and serviced Dundas Harbor. The cover is perhaps more than anything else a memento of my visit to the abandoned post office 70 years after it was canceled. Sometimes, as you can see, the meaning that I impart to collecting something is very different than what other collectors might consider the postal historic value with regard to frankings and transportation and the like. Next slide, please. The last cover that I wanted to show you is an 1877 Coaticook, Quebec cover. It's an early example of diplomatic mail sent to the United States. Its Prov Q double oval is quite a scarce cancellation. In the decade following Confederation, the United States operated up to 7 consulates in southern Quebec border towns. Their main purpose was to control trade by approving export permits and collecting tariffs. The cover resonates with me because my own foreign service career included postings as Canadian consul in Buffalo and Detroit, border cities in the United States. So I'm looking forward to learning more about postal history in today's symposium. I still consider myself to be a novice. I've never actually competed in a juried exhibition, nor have I ever written an article for a philatelic journal. Perhaps one day I will, but in the meantime, I use my collection to create stories about Canada that entertain my family and my friends. When they can experience the postmarks, the covers, stamps, and ephemera as a window to my soul, that satisfaction is really hard to beat. Thanks.
Thank you, Howard. What a fascinating journey. Oh my goodness, what fun you have. I mean, I was going to say I envy you, but I don't because I love what I do too. But what a wonderful way you have attacked this. Marvelous. Do we have any questions for Howard at this point? What is it? Starla. Oh, and Starla. Where are we? I can't see it.
I was just saying it's very well done and thank you very much.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you.
Learned a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Should we move on to the next?
Oh, Kevin.
Oh, Kevin. Oh, Kevin, you had a question posed.
Yeah, no, not so much a question. Thanks, Elizabeth. But yeah, I'd be happy to chat with you at some point offline about Dundas Harbor. Never had a chance to get there, but I've got a lot of material, including some commercial mail from Mounties that were posted there and that kind of thing. So happy to chat or correspond offline with you at some point. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that.
Shall we move on to tops? I have a little biography here that Tops emigrated from Finland to Canada as a youngster. He has lived in northwestern Quebec, Illinois, Oklahoma, Sault Ste. Marie, and the Victoria area. Along the way, he picked up a BSc in mathematics. Don't have much to talk about there, I can assure you. And you have done teaching, but your vocation has been that of a roofing contractor. Both parents were stamp collectors, and your mother was a postmaster in Finland. Married with 2 grown daughters, 3 grandchildren, a stamp collector since the age of 10. So we're going to, and the other thing is, Tops, would you please pronounce your name?
My whole name is Veli Jairi Tapanialopeus.
Hi,
You
Tops.
asked for it. That's why they call me Tops.
Yes. Would you like to begin?
Yes, indeed. Well, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you may be. My presentation is on the horn smelter, which is found in Noranda, Quebec. And the story of the horn smelter really begins with Edmund Horn. And perhaps we can have that picture of him in his canoe there. Edmund Henry Horn was born on February 13, 1865, in the area of Nova Scotia that became known as the Horn Settlement and later Enfield. When he grew up, he learned to be a prospector in the gold mines of Renfrew, Nova Scotia, and Oldham near his home. Later on, he traveled to Colorado and then to the gold camps of British Columbia and California. In 1908, he heard of silver discoveries in Cobalt, Ontario, and this drew him to this area. And perhaps we could have the picture of the map up there. This is the map of the area from 1924 that we are interested in. Sudbury lies to the west of this image. Timmins is off the screen to the northwest. Cobalt and Haileybury are roughly in the middle there, and that's where the arrows start of the route that he took by canoe and portage. And the area of the Rouyn-Noranda is up there where the arrows end. Larder Lake is shown on the Ontario side. It's very close as the crow flies to Rouyn-Noranda, and I'd like to say a word about it. In 1906, Larder Lake experienced the greatest gold rush in Ontario history. 3,000 men made their way to the area by canoe and portage to seek their fortune. 40 gold mining companies were established. There was a whole lot of hype that unfortunately did not pan out. By 1911, most of the town was abandoned. A large gold deposit was discovered there in 1936, and several working mines were established. So Edmund Horn reasoned that the ore deposits did not stop at the Ontario-Quebec border. The rock formations around Lake Rouyn attracted him. In 1911, he made his first canoe trip from Haileybury, the area indicated, to the Rouyn-Noranda area, and he found nothing. He went back in 1914. Once again, no significant discoveries. But he was an incredibly persistent fellow. He made another canoe trip in 1917. Nothing found. Did he pack up? No. He formed a small mining company called Lake Tremoy Syndicate in 1920 and then made several important discoveries. By 1925, it was confirmed that there were 1 million tons of gold and copper ore underneath the ground, and Horn's persistence paid off. The construction of the smelter was begun in May 1926. Let's have that picture of the post office. The first post office in the Rouyn-Noranda area was established on the shore of Lake Osisko by the Dumoulin family in 1924. Lake Osisko separates Noranda to the north from Rouyn to the south, and the Dumoulin family was the first actual family that moved to the Rouyn goldfield. Mr. Dumoulin had a great idea. In addition to the post office, let's establish a general store to supply all the newcomers. And he brought all the provisions with him. There was a problem. Nobody else knew that he was doing this. So everyone who came brought ample provisions for a long stay. There was a storm that hit a supply that he had ordered for his grocery store or for his general store, and it sank in a storm. I believe it was on Lake Osisko. The store and the post office didn't last much longer than a couple of years. Now I have a few pictures of some of the mail, the covers that were sent to Rouen and the goldfields there. And perhaps we could sort of go through them. The semi-postals, here's the front of one cover to Montreal, but if we could see the back of it, there you see Larder Lake being featured on this one. The first winter flight, 1924. The next one, please. Here again, covered to Montreal. And this was the first flight by Fairchild Air Transport Limited, Rouen to Haileybury, from whence Edmund Horne had started, and it's signed by the pilot. And next slide, please. And here's a closer look at the Fairchild semi-postal that shows the Rouen goldfields with the biplane. Next slide, please. And here's one Haileybury to Rouen. Now they say that 800 covers only were printed, but since then I've heard that it depends on the day. There might be there might be more. In any case, it's an interesting example with the ascending red type, and they say only 800 of those were printed. Next slide, please. Okay, here we get to the family history. Our family was a part of an immigrant wave from different parts of Europe in the 1950s. My father worked for 10 years as a miner, first in Wade Amulet Mine until it ran out of ore, and then in Noranda Mine. A planned residential community was constructed just south of the mine, and it was truly from many parts of Europe. As I think of my school friends, they had surnames like Zahorik and Starawajo and Simons, Finkelman, Miller, etc. Many of the miners brought their interest in philately to Canada. I remember going to a friend of mine in grade school, and he said, "I hear you collect stamps. Let's go back in the shed back there." And there was a huge burlap bag with stamps on paper. And he said, "Just put your hand in there and give me a few coins and you can have them." So I don't think it was actually his stock it was probably his dad's, but I got some of his stamps. We won't mention his name. Many of the miners had new contacts here as well as fellow philatelists in the old country. Here are a couple of covers that my father received from Czechoslovakia. We can show the next slide, please. Oh, there's another cover. There's my dad. Yeah, we'll go on. My dad is on the left in the second row on one knee there. That was my father. I should have pointed him out in the first one. And you can tell that this is one philatelist sending a cover to another. You could see the next slide. Even on the back of this, there's more information as to the route it took and more beautiful stamps. Next slide, please. And here's another cover, very colorful, just a joy to have, even if you're not a philatelist. I'd hang it on a wall somewhere. Okay, next slide, please. And there's the back stamp. Okay. Let's show the next slide. These were covers from South Africa. Not only were the immigrants connected to other philatelists in Europe, but this particular one is from a missionary in South Africa. Insufficient postage, as you can tell from the cover. Next slide, please. And here's another one with sufficient postage. We moved around a bit when we were in the Rouen-Noranda area, so they kept scratching out the address and putting in a new one. Next slide, please. Okay, as Rouen-Noranda grew, different interests from around the world contacted the people that were in service or in municipal politics. And this particular cover came to the mayor of Noranda, Mr. Herbert, and the context illustrated hot springs in Tiberias, Israel, and they were extolling the benefits of these hot springs and inviting the mayor to come to Israel. At this time, it would have been the Palestine area. No, it would have been Israel. This is I'll note that I had a system for dating these covers that I was collecting at that time. and it was not a good one. Don't do this. I marked the cover itself and put the date on, which happened to be 1 year earlier anyway. So I should have slid it in one of these clear plastic sleeves, and that would have saved it for posterity. Okay, next cover, please. Or that might be it. That's okay. So in 1922, the smelter and mine were incorporated as Noranda Mines. It grew over the years and diversified its holdings in the forestry, oil, manufacturing, and automotive industries. To reflect this diversification, the name was changed to Noranda Incorporated. By 2005, the company had operations in 18 countries. In 2005, it completed a merger with Falconbridge, and the name changed to that of Falconbridge. Less than a year later, it was acquired by Xstrata. In 2013, Xstrata was acquired by Glencore. So as I conclude this presentation, you may be wondering, why didn't I call it an introduction to Noranda or early mines in Northern Ontario and Quebec? Here's the reason. Noranda Mines ran out of ore in 1976. It could have died out and become one of these ghost towns that we see so many of in Northern Ontario and Quebec. However, the smelter remained active. It processed ores from other Abitibi mines initially, and from the 1980s on, it developed a system to recycle ores. Also, the smelter recovers gold, silver, platinum, palladium, and other metals from 68 different household products, including computers and cell phones. They diversified. 640,000 tons of sulfuric acid is produced there annually. That is then recycled into the food, pharmaceutical, and fertilizer industries. Concentrates are shipped to the smelter and processed. Now, Edmund Horne passed away on March 15, 1953 in Halifax. But the smelter that carries his name lives on, so to speak. There's his legacy. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much. We've just had a technical glitch here in Halifax. That was so interesting. Oh my gosh. It just astounds me of what people can find and search out, and we're so lucky to have people like you and like Howard. It's terrific. Any questions? As I'm trying to get back online here. Howard.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Tops.
Thank you.
To combine your presentation with mine, I see the impulses. You spent a lot of your youth, and no one who lived in Noranda at that time could escape the importance of mining and the dominance of that huge smokestack at the smelter, which still exists today.
Yes.
I was fortunate to visit it myself, and what really resonated with me was that Dumoulin post office, which is still there, and it still
exists on the shores of Lake Osisko as a museum, and they've gone to great pains to save some of that heritage.
Yeah, I guess it just validates for me that it's not hard to travel almost anywhere in Canada and find something that connects to postal history. Often it's going to be an old post office. Many of these are now National Historic Sites. Often it's going to be a plaque or a marker. But it goes to show you that it isn't simply postal history. Maybe the post office and what it meant over the years is now slipping into basically culture, into Canadian culture. Because once you add people to it, and I know that Bruce later on is going to do that in his presentation, it becomes very exciting. So thank you for bringing back a great memory of my trip up to Abitibi. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
We're back. And thank you, Howard, for your comments. Perhaps we'll move on to Jane now. And I won't repeat her biography as was read out earlier, but I'm just going to add that being the mother of Jane, her whole grade school career was based on stamps. Every project involved stamps. And it was an amazing way to learn, and wonderful for her parents as well, because we learned from those projects. Anyway, Jane, take over. Please. So some may have seen, this is an abbreviated version of a talk that I did for the Postal History Society of Canada a while ago. If you want to see the full presentation, it is available online. So I collect Guysborough, Nova Scotia, the whole county, but this is particularly about the community of Guysborough itself. So those of you who are know a little bit about Nova Scotia, we have Cape Breton Island and the Strait of Canso. This entire area is the county of Guysborough, and the community of Guysborough itself is here at the head of Shetibukdo Bay. And the reason that I'm interested in Guysborough County postal history is that Laurier Grant was a relative of ours, and he served as postmaster from 1921 until 1961. He lived in the post office building. He was employed as a caretaker of the building, and I was able to meet and interview him and talk to him about his time as postmaster, as well as with his wife Marion, who served as an assistant postmaster. And my dad talks about visiting in the summers and helping sort mail and things like that. So that's what got me focused on Guysborough itself. To go back in time, it's kind of an interesting post office in Nova Scotia, because it operated as a way office initially, but Mr. Robert Mollison Cutler thought quite a bit of himself, and he decided that he would create his own postal marking for the post office in Guysborough. So this was done without the okay of the authorities, but they seemed to just let it go because of who he was and his political offices and also his business connections. Even though he was the postmaster, really the fellow who did the work was Edward Irish Cunningham. And he ended up being a postmaster for somewhere in the vicinity of 55 years. So, and at the time that he was postmaster, you can see on this AF Church map, the post office was located in downtown Guysborough. That's being very generous, but on the high side of the street. So the next marking they got was a Guysborough paid marking, and one of the things I've done with this from an exhibit point of view is shown how the development and the use of different hammers at the Guysborough post office is reflective of most of the post offices across Nova Scotia, the Maritimes, and in fact most of Canada. Went through the same series of postmarks. So from there, they had this crown marking, which is quite attractive. And then a split ring. And this isn't the best copy I have, but I always like this this letter. So it's used as a receiver, but it was written from a fellow to his sister who was living in Guysborough. Who was married to a Cutler, common name in the community. And he says that he was quite tired of the seafaring life, but he also says that his next trip is to Port Adelaide in Australia from England. So if he wasn't already
done for from the seafaring life, I suspect that a trip from the UK to Australia would be sort of the last leg. I'm going to rush through because Bob is giving us the sign. They've also used rate markings, and then the Hadley family took over as postmasters. First William, then his wife Mary, and they built a new post office on the water side. This was where Laurier Grant lived in the top floors. And the granite was from a nearby quarry. And then from a postal history perspective, back to a different double split ring cancel, then the split ring with the cork obliterator. There was a steamer on a postcard earlier, and that would have likely been the steamer that this was too late for getting on the steamer to Canso. Then daughter Daisy took over, and she was allowed to retain the post office after her marriage, but she didn't for long, and that's when Laurier became the postmaster. And then they went through a series of different sized circular date stamps. I identify 7 different ones used over quite a period of time. They did use 2 different duplexes, but both of those were used for a very short period of time. Registered hand markings of different types were used in the office. And just to show that it still exists, they had a variety of these pictorial cancels that have been used just over the last few years. So that gives an overview just of what happened in Guysborough over the years.
Thank you, Jane. I'm not mute now, am I? No, you're good. mumble here, but the thing that struck me is how personal each of you has been in their collecting. And yet it's personal, but it's universal as well. It's just fascinating what people come up with. People are amazing. I have enjoyed each of these presentations, as I'm sure everybody else has. And I know that we are being hustled along to the next. Is there anything in particular anybody wanted to add at this point? Yes.
First, I'd say thank you to each of the presenters. I found it fascinating that so many pursued a family connection in terms of leading them to a particular area, and as Bob knows, I've been pursuing my own in that regard. And so interesting to see your stuff. I was curious though as to how you did the research to find out what was going on, maybe before your relatives first became involved, when you reach back to whether it's the early 1900s or the late 1800s. None of those folks are around to talk to today to ask about it. So where did you go for information? Thanks very much.
That.
I think Howard mentioned a really good resource, which is the list of postmasters and post offices, which is available through the Public Archives of Canada website. Yeah. In Nova Scotia, we've had a couple of books published on postal history, and we also had a very active Nova Scotia postal history study group at one point, so those have been invaluable.
Great, thank you. Some of the other folks have any other thoughts where they found the research?
I contacted the Dumoulin family or descendants of the Dumoulin, first Dumoulin family, and got tremendous valuable information, some of which I've shared from those people. They were so helpful. And to get rights to to present some of these pictures, of course, I had to go to Glencore and government archives. It was quite the process.
I'm going to intervene and say thanks so much to everyone. Where our time, unfortunately, is coming to a close, and I'm sure we could have had a really productive discussion to continue. So I am going to stop recording and thank you again.